the SICS YouTube too. So firstly, I'm Victoria Erskine. For those who don't know, I'm a lecturer in communication and one of the co-hosts of the School of Information and Communication Studies Research Seminar Series, along with Niloufar, who's with us as well today. I would just firstly like to welcome everybody here and acknowledge that I'm coming to you from the lands of the Darug and Gundungurra people in this virtual space. And I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the various lands on which we come and meet today, and encourage everyone to please share your the nation you are joining from. I would like to acknowledge elders past, present and emerging, and the traditions of our of the continuous culture that we celebrate here in Australia of our First Nations peoples. So without further ado, I am introducing Rachel Walls, who is a lecturer in communication here at Charles Sturt, and Rachel's bio and details about her topic are included in the notes. So I won't go into too much detail, except to say it's exciting to hear that Rachel has a chapter in a book being published, and she's going to share us with some other a piece of research she has collaborated on with some fellow Charles Sturt academics from the Faculty of Arts and Education. And so we're looking forward to hearing all about the upcoming publication of Exploring International University Immersion Programs, Researching Impactful Experiences, which sounds very worthy, and considering educational tourism as a tool of colonialist hegemony, and how that provides a unique lens through which to consider culture shock as a theme of the discussion. So without any further hold-ups, Rachel, over to you.
Thanks, Vic. And I just want to add that I'm joining this meeting from my office on Wiradjuri country, and it's always nice to share my ideas and my thinkings with my colleagues. So I'm hoping you can all see the presentation. Okay, cool. So this is about the chapter in the book. So the universities that we are coming to you from, we all collaborate to make this book, and many of the other chapters in the book are about the benefits of international study, touristic study, short visit study. So it's about taking groups overseas. And for me, the context is the New Colombo Plan. But there are other experiences in the book, and I think it's valuable for people to get a sense of what it means to go overseas with a group of students in different contexts. So this book supplies that by creating a sort of set of works that speaks to very different, unique, tailored experiences of different places. However, I think it's important to focus on the fact that when we do take students overseas, if it is New Colombo Plan funding, that these are strategic countries we go to, and that there is a soft power agenda. And that sort of on the outset creates a sense of imbalanced view through which we wish to assert power internationally. So the premise of my chapter is to create a sense of balance in the book by focusing in on that sense of the imbalance that is set up firstly through the premise of the New Colombo Plan, but also through the very simple idea of neo-colonialism as a prominent Western manifestation of a long history of culture that for me goes back to classical antiquities. So what I think is important is to think about what is it, it's not just to focus on like what it is and that it's, you know, not great, but how it manifests when students are overseas. And it seems to come up in terms of not being able to understand the culture and really feeling that participation gap manifests as culture shock. And seeing also the idea that you're going there to learn something and learn from your teacher. If your teacher is like me, coming from Australia, and is very different to the place that you're going to in the case of my chapter, which is about traveling to Japan, that there can create a really problematic disjoint between the hegemonic values of an academic in a culture they don't belong. that they can't, even if you go and go and go and spend time there, can you truly know everything? And the answer, of course, is no. So it's a complex destination, and it makes for an interesting case study. And so I started this chapter with the idea of what happened to my students and how did I address it in my travel. That students themselves thought they would be able to cope, and then had underestimated their inability to understand the in-country experience, even with pre-departure preparation. That they sought to sort of take over their environment with familiar behaviors that weren't welcome or polite in that country, and that they needed to be adjusted into fitting in better so that people wouldn't just look at them with hatred in their eyes through mimesis. It is a really simple thing. It goes back to a kind of, primary school. Oh, that's not good behavior. Look at so-and-so. They're doing so nicely. Why don't you do it the way so-and-so is doing it and see how you go? See how it feels to be polite. See if people treat you more nicely when you're polite. And so we, have to make these little adjustments, but also to allow them to express their experiences, whether they're positive or negative, through constructed affinity space. And so an affinity space is where you can take people, bring them together, and let the topic of discussion guide them through talking it out and feeling like they're connected through that. And so for students to come from various sectors of the arts degree into the international travel experience, because it wasn't one school program, it was available to anybody through the university and the arts and education, the whole faculty, that they could bond and learn about each other through their working out and hashing out the things that they were having issues with, and that we could talk together and try and sort of say, well, how can we approach this better tomorrow? How can we resolve this? How can we do more? And thinking about that sort of custodial care element, because when students experience cultural exclusion, as much as it is just normal, it has to be treated carefully because they're young and they're vulnerable and they may not understand why it's happening. And they may also not understand that they're experiencing racism. And I think it's valuable to not only point it out, but to discuss it so that they can understand better how these things work across societies. Because in Australia, we have it. In other countries, it's there. It's, no matter where you go, there's always going to be somebody who hates something or someone. And we, it's just whether you're giving, receiving, neutral, these things can vary. And so coming back to the kind of impetus, if you were getting a chance to go overseas because the government gave you money, the main objectives of the mobility plan can be framed as a colonial agenda of wanting to assert power. It's also, of course, in a modern context, considered to be just an aspect of international relations. But what are international relations? What are relations in general? They are a balance of power. And so we need to consider that the skills that students develop while they're overseas can be very different to the skills that DFAT seeks to deploy in sending people overseas. So they want soft power, but students really develop great soft skills. They learn that there's more than one way of living, that there's more than one way of doing, and that if you want to be able to comfortably negotiate a space, you do have to understand its rules to at least the extent that you can play by them, or the participation gap gets in your way. And so the thing that's really interesting is that there are some recent changes to NCP that try to mitigate this in terms of focusing on things like language and cultural study, which I think legitimizes and changes the flavor of it. It used to be much more open. And the framework of these reflections is in that more open period before they narrowed that down. I do think narrowing it down changes it. And the reason is because there's no subject of study at our university that focuses on Japanese culture or Japanese language. And so I think it's really important to speak to, firstly, Cool Japan, which is the external advertising from the Japanese government that tries to simplify Japanese culture and attach it to tchotchkes and movies and really simple routines that can be sort of seen as cutified and adorable and fetishized. And the internal discourse of Japaneseness, and it's very bespoke and tiny rituals, cultural mannerisms, the history, which is very long. There's a kind of intentional cultural exclusion there where it's like the only people who can appreciate Japaneseness are Japanese people. And that's not trying to be negative. It's just a kind of part of the discourse. So on one hand, there's a door opening saying, please come in, please come in. And on the other, there's something saying, this is not for you because you could not possibly ever understand it. And these two things clash through the invitation of tourism to places and the way that those places receive those tourists. So on a very basic level, it's a little bit troublesome. And so I like to think about what we can do to mitigate that. When I take students to Japan, we visit the Meiji Jingu Cultural Institute. It's an intercultural, a place of exchange, and our students do receive lectures in Shinto faith. They receive training in how to successfully and politely negotiate environments like the one on screen, because what it is and why it is. There's so many different kinds of places, but they all require certain types of behaviors. And people come from all over, even the internal tourism through Japan to visit sacred sites is, it's massive. So the thing is that there are two separate kind of streams of engagement where you have people who are following a practice of faith and people who are just visiting. And that happens everywhere around the world. People who go to a chapel because they want to look at the architecture. People who go to a chapel because they want to pray. There's no difference except that there's so many different little rituals that people don't think about or understand. It's easy for a tourist to make some really horrible mistake. And so we get people accustomed. We give them some training. And so the thing that's really important is that, a lot of people see sites like this through movies, and they see sites like this through cartoons. And they think that they may understand things about how things work there because of how actors exist in a space. But of course, that's a fictional space. And so the capacity to negotiate in a real way is very different. And so we do try and give students enough education that they feel more confident to negotiate that with a sense of politeness that is inculcated by people who are experts in that. They're not coming to me for the advice. They're going to a Shinto place of worship and study and receiving lectures. And we do that with culture as well. So when I take students over there, they get lectures at Saitama University regarding arts and culture and history, especially with non-tangible, like intangible cultural heritage, things like theater and design work, so that there's, ways that they can combat their lack of knowing. There's enough information, there's experts that they can ask questions of in that other destination. And I'm sure that every single one of us who designs a trip, we have a partner university, we go there, we let them be the experts. The problem is that there's so much time you spend away from those experts with your students, and they're going to ask you. And it does create a tension in terms of the academic hegemonic power that you have. And that's why for me, I always say, well, we'll go and visit so-and-so and we'll ask them. Or let's have a look at what such and such says, because I want to defer to the culture and the society and let it be the primary knowledge holder, even though my students feel safer thinking that that's me. So things that help students to negotiate daily life, I take them to supermarkets. I take them to places and I say, look at the way they've got this signage here. Look at this wayfinding. Look at how they want people to self-organize in order to efficiently deal with things. And so there's all sorts of little things, especially in a densely populated space, where students in Australia would not see that normally, because even a place like Sydney is just not bananas crazy crowded, right? We don't have so many folk that there's a real rule of staying on the left side of the sidewalk so that other people who need to go the other way can get through. We don't necessarily have that level of wayfinding signage throughout our urban environments. And so you do have to actually demonstrate it and you have to show it. But wherever possible, bringing students into experiences where they're going to learn from people who are in that culture. I mean, I've taken people through the National No Theater with their training team, so that they're learning about no theater from people who train their actors and stuff like that. So it's about creating a connection to the local knowledge holders wherever possible. And what I want to come back to in terms of why it's important and why this chapter is about neo-colonialism is about the origins of modern understandings of work and play. And I want you to stay with me for a moment because it feels a little abstract. But the Digest of Justinian, or the Digesta, or the Digest, as some people would call it, speaks about these separated values of human status in a period of slavery. This is like ancient Rome, right? So the idea is that freedom is one's natural power of doing what one pleases, save insofar as it is ruled out either by coercion or by law. And slavery as an institution of the jus gentium, whereby someone is against nature, made subject to the ownership of another. So against nature, meaning to deny that freedom, denying that power of doing what one pleases. Against nature, a slave is not a natural state, is basically the gist there. And so in older times, we had a stratified society whereby people owned other people, and those other people, against their nature and against their will, did stuff for the benefit of other people who were free. That's not what we do now. But what we do have is a system where we take turns between working and doing something for someone else against our nature, potentially, and having free time with which to do what we please. And we don't think so much about it because we're either at work or at rest. But when we go on vacation, we make a very substantial investment in that time as a protected, altered state that has nothing to do with our normal turn taking of being at rest and being at work. It is a time in which we genuinely see ourselves as being free. And because we see ourselves as being free, we are more likely to obey our natural power of doing what we please, even if the habitus we take with us to other places doesn't make sense in that place. So, for example, with my students, that might be taken out through, say, 4 of them walking side by side and chatting loudly on a Tokyo sidewalk when people are trying to get to work, and it gets in people's way, and it's rude, and it's unnecessary. But because in Australia we have a lower population density, and nobody's in a hurry to get anywhere so much, it's not a problem here. So even little acts can be about wanting to do what's naturally pleasing to us, and it may not necessarily be what is valuable to others. And so when we think about this idea of the work and leisure and the abstract and completely other space of being overseas and having made an investment in being there and having set that time aside for a specific survey of lands, which is in and of itself somewhat colonialist as well, it does facilitate a disregard of rules in favor of doing what one pleases. And it invites this assertion of habitus in novel environments. And so the thing that's for me really important is to think about the fact that a lot of the times what we experience in our culture comes from a long lineage of things that we don't actively think about. And I think this is not necessarily a thing that informs all cultures. This is a Western construction. And so people who come from other parts of the world where this sort of text and this sort of behavior is not perhaps present, perhaps they don't experience this. And perhaps in a modern context, they don't practice this. But it's for people who have come out of a kind of Western European civilization, this is definitely a component of what are we now and where did we come from and why are our habits such? So there are elements here that I do think need to be considered. And when we think about the idea of tourism as a possible exertion of power and exertion of doing what pleases, it could also be seen as an act of elitism. It's also about the consumption of a place, which, you know, is reinforced in Japan by the Cool Japan strategy to create something that can be an attraction, a spectacle, or a fetishized version of itself. And by doing this, by being both a fetishized, minimalized culture and by exerting colonial elitism, this sort of works together to invite what I would call careless visitation. And so because of this, there's this desire to continue and perpetuate something that's been happening for a very long time, which is to do what one pleases unless it breaks the law. And there are many ways to be inappropriate in public without necessarily breaching the law to the extent that somebody's going to come for you. So the thing that's important for me is to try and combat this. And as I said, this is about making sure that local cultural and tertiary knowledge holders are engaged as the primary teacher as much as possible. You know, and I see myself as just a guide and possibly a translator to the extent that that's my gift. That I try and model and explore ways of showing people things so that they can naturally look for it themselves, seek out the example. How are other people lining up at the cash register? How are other people seeking attention in a restaurant? How are other people dealing with visiting a museum or a theater or whatever? And trying to defer to that local knowledge, even if the appearance of your own knowledge is for the student exceptional. You know, the students, when they see me speaking in Japanese to Japanese people, they are impressed. But what is the value of somebody being impressed when they don't know the language? I could literally be saying, "Me hungry, give food." They wouldn't know, right? And neither would I. So the thing that's really important is that there's the way that we create value can be incredibly speculative. And so we do need to put checks and balances in place that meaningfully remind the student that while we are their teacher, that we've taken them to a place to seek out teachers that are more appropriate and more valuable in that space. And so the chapter itself and its value is to create a sense of counterpoint within the volume, because most of the other chapters deal with, I went here and I went there, and my students did this and my students did that, and it was beautiful. Whereas mine is like the little palate cleanser that you have between courses. And it's also really useful as a reminder, because for students who are younger, who may be having their first international experience, they're more likely to come up against participation gaps. And so trying to resolve those through appropriate knowledge sources is really important. And I think that it's always wise to remember that there's going to be some people who have been traveling for a number of years because they're grown older people, and some people who will be young, but not all of them are particularly going to be mindfully, respectfully bringing our values on tour. And so it is always good to keep our values of making the world better in sight when we take people overseas. Because just as there are people who behave poorly when they are at the supermarket register, there are definitely people who behave poorly when they think they've paid a premium price to be in a place, and that sort of means something or deserves something. So the chapter invites structural design considerations to intervene in some of these processes, to not only combat culture shock, but to sort of dig into some of these undertones of why it exists, and to respond to experiences of racism with an understanding of neo-colonialism and why that might be happening. You know, what is every person's part in cultural experience? Because it's not just about, I'm here as a visitor and why am I being treated so boopy? It's also about when somebody comes to me in my country, how am I helping them? How am I giving them a positive experience? Or am I also being unkind, uncharitable, etc.? So what I will do is briefly engage with the work. Let me just stop sharing my screen. And let me just get out of that. So there's a small section I will read about soft power and rites of passage, just to give you a taste, because there's time, because I talk so fast. So DFAT's New Colombo's plan scheme targets strategic partnerships where the exertion of soft power is deemed valuable. The NCP scheme also purports to grant students opportunities to learn from the places they visit, which sits uncomfortably against the neo-colonial hegemonic values of soft power assertion. The purpose of the New Colombo Plan mobility trips are ultimately bound in DFAT's external partnership agenda, framing such trips as opportunities to exercise soft power abroad while attaining a rite of passage through travel. The internal development narrative of a rite of passage presents a social construct that exists outside the cultural location of being visited. It presents the visit itself as an act through which to obtain personal strength, inviting a sense of dominance and thus colonialism. This is further enhanced by the marketing of such trips, a process wherein the essential message is centered on an acceptable and accessible version of a novel culture. It problematizes students' understanding of cultural by perpetuating mythos of effortless accessibility, while promoting a unique personal experience of development without articulating the source of that growth. Culture shock and its attendant cycles through which crisis initiates change are not part of the travel narrative presented. The obvious reason being that stress is unpleasant and therefore goes unadvertised. There are positive ways to frame challenge as a developmental tool of achievement, but this does not seem to appear in the travel narrative. It would set expectations better to present a complex travel destination as just that, and give students a sense of benefit from rising to meet that challenge. And it is possible that the rite of passage is exactly this, but without it being clearly articulated, its meaning is deleted. And the fact of travel itself takes on the role of a traditional survey of lands. So that's a brief section from the work. I don't want to read too much because there's all these rules in the contract. You have to read it yourself. So it's a bit short, but hopefully that's enough to have a discussion if you want. Or I can, if you have questions about some of the content, because I know it's a little dense and I went through quickly, I'm happy to chat about it.
Thanks, Rachel. No, I'm sure there's questions, and I'm fascinated to hear what Anita thinks as being a fellow New Colombo Plan recipient and others. So Sindiso has his hand up first, so please jump in.
Okay. Thanks for your presentation, Rachel. I'm just worried about the contradictions, like you talk of neo-colonialism, at the same time you talk of Japan.
Yeah.
Because Japan was one of the most imperialistic countries. Yep. So how do you reconcile that?
I don't think you can. And I think that there's a lot of sort of different waves throughout history of colonization and subjugation that nations experience. And I mean, Japan is definitely one of them. You know, they've created harm to their neighbors, but they've also been harmed by neighbors and by other parties. I think that, so for example, one of the places I take my students is Hiroshima. We go to the Peace Park, we go to the Peace Dome, we go to all of the different places that we can go to learn about what happened there. Because that, again, was a subjugation, you know, the occupation of Japan after the war by American forces has really, in a way, informed the modern cultural norms. It's really bizarre because there's a kind of love-hate relationship there between some of the cultural ephemera of overseas, but also a desire to keep it out. So what's tricky, I think, is that to go from one nation that has done colonialism to another that has done colonialism and expect them to be either similar or different or have a pattern. I mean, it's not like one nation is good and one nation is bad and one nation's doing it right and one nation's doing it wrong. We all do it, but we all experience it differently when we are outside of the environment we have learned to understand. So for me, when I go there, sometimes I get accosted on the street by people because of what I look like. They just yell at me and tell me to go home. That's the prerogative. I understand why. I can't stop it. And I have to accept that some people are really just, they don't want me there. That's not a problem. It's just, I mean, it's a problem in terms of, people being decent and nice. But I can't control other people's decency and nicety to me. But when it happens and my students are there, I need to account for it. And I need to be able to talk to them and explain it. And I think that to an extent, at least showing them some of these histories and looking at how colonialism works can help them to mentally process that. You know what I mean? Does that make sense?
Yeah, makes sense.
Anita?
Well, it is indeed contextual and complex, isn't it, Rachel? Look, I'm just going to pop down to a very practical set of questions because maybe I missed it, but when was the program? When did it take place? How long was it? What was the focus? Who were involved? Were there any partner there?
Yeah. So this is information compiled across a couple of trips, and the trips were undertaken around 2017 and I believe maybe 2018. There were a few trips across a few years. They were mixed cohort students. We had a subject specifically made to accommodate the students being from different learning areas. And it was basically a project subject that applied a placemaking process so that you had to study the destination before you departed, go through certain types of cultural education while we were there. And that was through Saitama University. We dealt with people through their theater department. We also visited one of the world's most renowned No Theater mask makers and prop makers. We went to the No Theater to be taught by their acting instructor. So there was for every kind of, when we had students from theater and theater media, those were the activities I would respond with. So I would look at who was coming on the trip and cater to their needs on the fly and construct within the budget I was allowed activities that would respond to their needs. But they were, because they mostly were many were from the theater media degree and from the photography degree and from the animation degree. So I would build in opportunities to learn from people on the ground, either through the university or through cultural institutions. And they were generally the premier flagship cultural institutions. So it'd be like the Arts Council and stuff like that.
And how long was it?
About 3 weeks.
Program?
So it was a longer program. For the short study program, it was generally about between 3 and 4 weeks long. It ran during the 90 term to facilitate that outside of normal class times, and it incorporated multiple destinations, focused on experiences that would build their competencies, as well as, just traveling across different cities was for them kind of a drain. But it encompassed everything from larger cities to very small places, like taking them to Tomonora, which is a small fishing village south of Hiroshima, because at that time, it was still well known for being the source of art direction for the Miyazaki film Ponyo by the Sea. It's just an animated film. So for the animation students to be able to look at the finished film and see the actual places that were the design inspiration, like I got access to some of the architecturally important sites there to help the students. So it was, yeah. So yeah.
Yeah, it's really great to hear your perspective, because I always ask myself, why did they change? As you know, I've received NCP student mobility last year and also this year, but I've always asked myself, why did they make it quite rigid now that there is a minimum of 28 days in country and there has to be a certain program set for a certain discipline. Now I get where it comes from. So this is probably the way, as you said, how DFAT is trying to, improve and better the
I think so. Yeah. I think so. I do think that while it is a little frustrating that on one hand, they specifically want programs responding to teaching and studying in culture and language, and universities are finding it harder and harder to run those programs and are cutting those programs. So there's a kind of mismatch between what we offer and what they want, which I think will become exacerbated in the coming years. But I do see the value of that, because the provocation for my students of responding to an environment that I knew they wouldn't be able to truly understand was to really poke that bear. And that wasn't really the advertised learning outcome, but hiding underneath it all was this desire for people to understand that there are other ways of living. And it's not that your way of living is the best way of living. It's just one way of living. There are many cultures in this world. And if you want to be part of a more global society, you need to at least be able to accept that what you do where you live may not be correct in the places you go. Like a handshake versus a bow. Some people don't want you touching them, right? In some cultures, it's rude, right?
Yeah, and that actually is related to, sorry, Vic, if I keep on, because this is kind of interconnected. It's interesting to hear your perspective from our end, if that makes sense. Although even our perspective, our lens are different across even people in this room. Like I run program with through NCP to Indonesia, and I do have that background, so it's probably going to be a bit different, right? But I was just wondering if there has been any investigation or any question asked about how is it perceived from the Japanese perspective, because what I've listened from to you, what I've heard from you is from our perspective as Australian or whatever, coming to a different country or a different set of cultural practice, if you like.
That's difficult, because even though when I'm there and I have discussions with people who are Japanese, there is an element of politeness wherein people don't generally look at you and say, go away. Like normal, like it's not going to happen. Be like, oh, we'd really love for you to come to our atelier, and the senior workshop dude is happy to meet your students, blah blah blah, right? So there's a kind of the official language of it versus people's unfiltered thoughts. That is difficult to gauge, because even if I were to do a survey and say, please tell us about your experience of our students visiting your workshop, they're not going to be honest. If they really don't want you there, they're just going to say, that's nice. There's an old expression in Kyoto that if somebody wants you to go away, they'll comment that you have a beautiful watch.
Go away.
Because it reminds you of the time. It asks you to decide for yourself that you should leave. The culture is not really straightforward. So it's difficult. And I think it's just wise to assume that people have business to run, they have things to do, and if you take up their time, there needs to be some kind of something valuable in it for them.
Well, that is probably an opportunity for co-research, Raj, for you with your colleagues in Japan, and you know, revealing that would be great, because then we do need to learn from them as well, I suppose, and that enriches our perspective. But thank you for the great presentation. Sorry for bombarding you with questions.
That's fine.
I'm going to segue. I'm going to segue there, so not to cut you off, Rachel, but to say that I was interested in the notion of, and I haven't applied for NCP funding, so I'm not familiar. I've seen it, but I read it, but I haven't gone through the process myself, about the exchange of knowledge rather than that. So that piece, and the other piece, I understand the soft power influence there, and obviously interesting choice of soft skills, because it sounds like they're not so much, they are soft skills, but they're also critical skills, the way that you've positioned that nuance of understanding language and space and behavior and context. So I'm interested in how, and I imagine DFAT's, the political or the philosophical agenda is to build critical skills of understanding and bridge building and knowledge sharing, rather than the colonial perspective. So I'm interested in that, what you think about that.
I know what you mean. I think that it's always flawed. So because the students are not studying the language or the culture, when we go there, there's of course two things to consider. One is that I'm taking them to people who are experts in their fields, and two, that those experts can reasonably communicate with my students without my intervention, which means they're speaking English. And so it feels as though everybody's coming to us, everybody's catering to us. And there's nothing particularly wrong with that, but it means that the students aren't necessarily having an equal and equitable sense of exchange. And because they don't have their own language skills to work with, we can't do class integration. So normally what you would do in an NCP class trip when students have studied the language and culture is you go and you'd spend some time in the university, and the students would integrate into a class, and they would interact with students in that place so that they can have genuine free conversations. We can't really do that in the same way. So it's tricky. Does that make sense?
Yeah, true. But I understand that that it's a totally different experience, isn't it? But also, so you inferring that the language and tone around the communication about NCP in recruitment, in your funding application, all of that thing is about that, the intention of the soft power colonial narrative?
I think, well, so here's the thing. If what you're reading is the application process, then you won't see it. If you read the policy documents that inform why that fund exists, you will see it. It is designed to meet a specific cultural objective of the government. It's not a gift, it's a strategy. So, I mean, it's similar to, I mean, Japan has one too. It's called MEXT. They invite people from all over the world to study on scholarships so that they can become, useful in the context of being informed about that culture and then taking it back home, right? So lots of countries have funds that are set aside to engage in a soft power relationship with people from other places. It does, I think, to a degree, bring people into intercultural work and policy, but for many students, it is seen as fairly touristic. So we need to think about the balance of not only how does the government advertise the NCP versus how is the policy informing its existence, but also I think, well, how does our university's global office advertise the trip? What are they selling to the student? That's interesting as well.
Yeah, no, I get that. That's from the communication element. That interests me. Anybody else got any questions they would like to ask Rachel, or comments? So you're saying the funding models changed. Is that to prioritize language-based courses?
And culture-based courses. So, I mean, and I think that's important, and I think it's smart, because when you're there for longer, I think that you should be able to engage. You should be able to independently learn. And it's like when I was there, I felt like a mother duck with all these little baby ducks behind me. And they followed me everywhere because they were terrified. And I get that. I get it. They were in a place where they thought they'd be all right. And then they got there and went, oh man, this is really hard. I was like, yeah, it is.
Sort of the experience that's being uncomfortable, being
You got
comfortable.
to put in some effort. You got to put in some effort if you want to go overseas and feel comfortable, like learn,
Exactly.
Yes, Jacques.
Hey, just to that discomfort,
Yes.
I think Google Translate has changed that since your field trips.
I know.
And I think that's great because while the discomfort might motivate students or any traveller to learn the language, I think the fact that the barriers are much less and the fear is less and the ability to get yourself out of trouble or just negotiate everything, I think that's a great thing.
I get what you mean. I get what you mean. I see the value in the technology. I worry that people will stop trying so hard from one more tool doing it for you. I mean, was it Roland Barthes said that the photograph deletes the photographer? Does Google Translate delete the wonder of discovering language? Do they have a cap per funding application? I'm not sure. I think that changes year to year. But
no, they don't have a cap. I don't think, Tina. It's really depending on the applicants.
Yeah.
Now, like how many students do we want to apply? But the requirements for like specificity and like, so it's not like open study visit or open study tour as such anymore. And the requirement to be there, including language and or culture. So this is related to Jock's point on the Google Translate. I think, well, my personal opinion is it's not just about language. When we say culture is the everyday culture, doesn't necessarily mean that students have to master the language before they go either, because it's not always possible. But just to understand that, people like what you said, Rich, someone walk on the path, footpath in the morning, or what kind of food do they eat in the morning? What kind of aroma that you were
that's
smelling,
true.
that sort of thing.
Yeah. Well, like it's like, I mean, I know in Japan, like the perfume is weird. You don't go to a restaurant stinking of perfume. It's just rude. That's just rude. It is. So, there's really simple little things, and there's heaps of them, and that's every culture, right? It's like, it's just the way it is. So the thing is that unless you spend a lot of time in a place, or you're born in a place and raised in a place, it's hard to know these things. And so while Google Translate might help you understand a restaurant menu, the thing that's really difficult is that students won't get into those restaurants. Because I know that from my own experience when I'm over there, they see the foreign person, and even if the restaurant is empty, the answer is we have no tables. Because they perceive the effort of dealing with you to get that order out of you as too much effort for the amount of money they're making to serve that meal. And I think that it's important to think about that barrier. There's nothing wrong with it if you understand it and just you have to just accept it, because it's not like, what are you gonna do? It's not every place that's like that, but the students notice it, right? And so they might feel empowered by Google Translate, but it can bite them in the bum even harder when they know the word because of their phone. But that's it, and everybody knows it, and they still don't want to talk to you. So it's useful to have some language skills, but it's not what we're teaching them. So we can't expect it. Yeah.
Well, they're not mutually exclusive. I mean, I actually think potentially it could even inspire you to learn. The more you communicate with Google Translate, the more you think, if I had language, I could communicate. But also,
Absolutely.
I agree with everything people said, but I also think that Google Translate could be, or just being able to communicate on some level is an access to the culture. So you can ask people about, why are you having that completely weird breakfast?
Well, yeah.
I think it's just food for thought for us to continue our passion for those of us who are interested in exchange with students on international experiences. Rachel, I think you've given us lots to think about, and what in not only in the experience itself, but in the politics or the intention behind that. So what kind of funding sources should we be aiming for, and what are most beneficial to our students in the experiences we're looking for, and interrogating that is interesting, and it's certainly made me think about things in a slightly different way than I had 45 minutes ago.
Well, the whole process made me feel really odd about doing it. It's sort of it felt weird ethically. And so I did it a few times, and I thought, I think I'll step away from this and just give it a rest. And then we had COVID, so things have been challenging just because of that. But the changes and the constraints that have been placed upon it, I think, are an effort to deal with some of that more touristic element.
Yeah.
But I still think that when we design trips and we take people elsewhere, that we should be mentally taking notes of how are we going to build learning opportunities into our trip that give our students more cultural flexibility. Because as far as I'm concerned, if you can adapt to a culture that you do not understand in terms of country, it also means you can join a new company with its own internal culture and adapt and find your way faster. And that's what I mean in terms of soft skill development.
Yeah, and in terms of someone who's interested in organizational culture and communication is the glue to do that. You've got me there. Has anybody else? Tina's been popping some messages in. Thank you. And I think that Anita's answering those. Has anybody else got anything they wanted to add? Or Rachel, is there any final thoughts? When is the book out? When can we read your chapter?
The book, I have no blessed idea. So the book was meant to be live on the 1st of June. And I checked before I went away last week, and it was still on pre-order. So it's a bit of a magical question that I'll have to put to Matt Harding. Because I think he's the primary point of contact. Mysteries of the universe.
On your effort and extending the research validity of something that's a reflective piece on something that's also feels really contemporary, even though that study happened a couple of years ago. It does feel very contemporary. So thank you for sharing. Thank you for stepping up. Thank you, everyone, for coming. We can give everyone a 5-minute break, and we'll end it there if everyone's okay. Anything else more to add? No. Thank you for coming. Thanks, Rachel.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, Rachel.
Bye.